So good afternoon, my name's John Craig. I'm co-chair of the BSA Teaching and Learning Network. This afternoon in the next of our webinars, we are looking at pastoral care online, and we have two speakers with us today to take us through some of the challenges of that topic. The first is Dr. Cathy Elliott of UCL. Cathy is a senior teaching fellow in the Department of Politics there. And over the past few years, she's been responsible for pastoral care, she estimates, of over 500 students. So she's certainly got lots of experience in terms of this area. Her first book was Democracy as Foreign Policy, Temporal Otherings in International Relations, which deals with the way in which British identity is produced through stories about democracy. And she's co-presenting with Dr. Emily Robinson from the University of Sussex. Emily is a senior lecturer in politics and currently working on, well, co-authoring an emotional history of Brexit Britain, both of which books sound absolutely fascinating. I advise you to read one and put the other one on your to-buy list for when it comes out. In terms of housekeeping points, we are recording the session today, so and that recording will be published by the PSA and BISA online. Do please keep your microphone off during the recording session, and if you want to turn your camera off as well, by all means do. And please, if you have questions for the presenters, please post those on the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and then I'll pose those questions to the speakers at the end of their talk. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Cathy and Emily for your presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Right, so I'm Cathy. Thanks ever so much for coming in the middle of the summer. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I'm not really an expert on online learning, as I suppose a lot of us aren't, but I was a student at the Open University for a long time, and that was probably one of my happiest times as a student, I think. So I feel a bit more positive about the online learning than maybe some of my colleagues do. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Emily?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in online learning either. I'd just been preparing to teach about emotions for the first time, and had been thinking about how to do that in the classroom, and then suddenly having to think about how to do that not in the classroom. I was really pleased when Cathy asked if I was interested in doing this, because I think there's a lot to talk about that I'm interested in thinking about as well.
Oh, and now I can't move on to the next slide for some reason. That's good. Oh, we thought we had it all. There we are. Apparently that worked. Okay, so the question we wanted to ask today is, how do we make sure our students are okay when we're all trapped in little boxes on the screen? And I suppose that the thing that made me want to talk about this was really that I always used to think I had a kind of superpower of being able to get students to talk to me and tell me what was bothering them or tell me what they were stuck with. And it's only now that we're all online that it's becoming a bit more explicit to me exactly what I was doing when I was exercising this superpower, which was something to do with being very still and very quiet and not filling the silence. And it was also something to do with staying quite calm. And I think that sort of creates a sort of feeling of safety when you're there together in a room. And both of those things, I think, are things you do with your body. And so when you're online, all of that superpower is taken away from you, and you have to think of different ways in order to have that same effect. So that's what I've started to think about.
Yeah, I wanted to think about some of the sort of particular challenges that might come up as well. And I guess one of the things I've been sort of thinking about, based a little bit on experience at the end of last term, was, you know, if you have a group of students, some of whom have their cameras on and some don't, you know, how do you make sure that students you can't see are sort of not only as included, but as, you know, that you're thinking about them as much, and, you know, how you kind of check in on them seems a little bit harder, particularly when you can see the others. I think also, you know, when Cathy was saying about sort of sitting still, she's mentioned to me that you know, if you do that online, it can look as if your maybe your internet connection is frozen. But I also think it can look as if, you know, you're maybe distracted, maybe you're actually scrolling your emails. And students might think that of us, but equally we might think it of them, whether or not they actually are. So, the potential for distraction, or at least sort of the paranoia that other people are distracted, that they've got other things on that screen in front of them. And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about, particularly because I teach a big first year module, is how to create those kind of opportunities for students to kind of get to know each other informally, the sort of thing where, maybe they would ordinarily be, complaining about us behind our backs or whatever. That kind of socializing and bonding isn't going to happen unless we kind of can create spaces for it to happen. So sort of thinking about, how we create kind of spaces for them to talk without us there as well, I think is probably really important.
Yeah. We wanted to start off with this slide because I think quite often we come to this point last when we're discussing care and emotions and looking after students, which is that, so we didn't want to leave it as an afterthought to say, you can't look after other people if you're burned out yourself. And so this principle of you look after yourself first before you assist others, I think is really, really important. This has been a really difficult time. Next term is going to continue to be really difficult as we get into winter, and somehow, queuing for the shops is fine now, but when it's pouring with rain and it's dark, we're all going to be really fed up and really stressed out and really worried about what might happen next. So what we don't want is to be so tired and stressed and at the end of our tether that we're snapping at students or we're snapping at colleagues. And so I think, you might have your own top tips, and maybe we can talk about that later, for how you take care of yourself. But I think that's just a really, really important thing to think about when we're thinking about pastoral care.
And I think a lot of it is stuff that we probably should be doing anyway, things like saying, we're available during these times, this is when we will be responding to messages and discussion boards or to emails or whatever, and not sort of feeling that we have to respond all of the time. But I know I certainly will find that hard in the first place, but also have been finding it even harder during this period. It feels like students kind of need us more, and so it feels sort of the least we can do is to reply to them at 8 o'clock on a Friday night or whatever. Actually, I think that doesn't help. It doesn't help them, and it doesn't help us, and it creates an expectation that if you're not there responding immediately, then there's a problem. And the more I've talked about this with colleagues, the more I realise, well, first of all, that I need to be doing more of it myself, but also that there are ways we can do it as well. Creating, using kind of apps, for instance, for creating appointments, rather than having every student email you separately, making different appointments. You can set up an online system where they can do it themselves, like they would if they were booking in at a hairdresser's or something. And people might well be doing all of this. I know I haven't been, and I'm fully intending to in the next term.
Yeah, those boundaries are so important, aren't they, when your life and your home and your work are all in the same place as well. Yeah. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, looking into various definitions of pastoral care. And when I did a Google Images search for pastoral care, the first thing that came up was this dog feeding this lamb with a bottle, and I just thought you would enjoy to see that, so that's the one that I've used. But there's quite a lot of literature. If you just do a Google Scholar on pastoral care, there's quite a lot of literature on St. Paul, and as a kind of an original pastoral carer, and I thought that was quite interesting and quite pleasing, because it goes to show that pastoral care has been remote and has been done in forms of written communication for as long as almost we've had it as a concept. But rather than go into all these complicated definitions, I just thought in the end I would go for UCL's definition of pastoral care, which is to talk about well-being and to talk about success as elements, the crucial elements of pastoral care. And I think there's quite a lot to unpack in that. But I mean, my starting point always is that teaching is about relationships, and that we are actually, when we're teaching, we are in a caring profession, and that's absolutely core to who we are and what we do. And the ways in which we're caring for our students is to ensure that they're feeling all right, that their well-being is taken care of, and that they're able to think about what success means for them and how they might achieve that, whatever it is. Okay, so we're going to take the risk of doing a quick Menti, and ask you to think yourself in your pedagogical practice, so thinking about the ways in which your philosophy of teaching meets your practice of teaching. what does well-being mean in your classroom? I assume you've all used Menti before, but if not, you just go to menti.com and you use the code which is on your screen, which is 273846, and it should come up as a word cloud. If it isn't working, tell me. Oh, there we are. Yeah, this is lovely. Yeah, so I really like, so there's these ideas about listening, support, trust, security. Mental health is the first step, right? It's the building block. Engagement, concentration. Yeah, really nice. So, I mean, one thing you might want to think about is like, how did it feel doing that Menti in comparison with if I'd asked you to put your hand up and talk in class? So we came up with sort of similar ideas, I think. So when we were thinking about well-being, we thought about ideas of caring for each other, but also connectedness. Can you learn if you're not connected with the other people in your class? Feelings of belonging. Do you belong to the institution? Do you belong to your class? Do you belong with the other students? Do you feel confident? I think resilience is really, really important in terms of being able to take the knocks of getting something wrong and being able to pick yourself back up and carry on learning. Support not just from teachers, but from each other. Kindness, which perhaps we don't think about enough in our academic lives, safety, and that kind of basic thing of knowing where to go for help if needed. So I think we're all sort of thinking in the same way and perhaps using slightly different words. Okay, and then this one, I wasn't sure if you would say the same things as we said, but I wonder if you could, again, it's a word cloud, so don't write too much, but what comes to mind when you think about supporting students to define success for themselves and achieve success? It's an unclear question. I think that's really useful, right? And I really hope that students feel okay to say that to us, to say, oh, that question's not very clear. Can you rephrase it? Right. So yeah. Doing your best is nice, right? Your best is different depending on who you are.
I like the realistic expectations as well. I think that's
Yeah, I saw a really nice thing on Twitter before where somebody had made it clear to students in their syllabus this an idea about sort of the work-life balance, and that there is no expectation that you should be reading all night, right? And that actually if you are reading all night, if you have unrealistic expectations of how much you should be working, then you're out of balance, and that's something that's bad for your learning, not good. Yeah, explaining what we want, I think that's really important. Yeah. Yeah. So what we thought when thinking about success was a similar sort of set of things from what you're talking about, right? So being able to engage, understanding what's wanted from you. But I think you can't succeed unless you're ready to get it wrong. You can't succeed unless you're able to be vulnerable. So in a way, if you really, really want to succeed, that's almost the opposite approach from what will enable you to succeed. Because if you really, really want to succeed and you're very, very focused on your marks, then it's going to be much more difficult to dismantle the kind of defensiveness that comes with really, really wanting the top marks and always wanting to be right, and admit that sometimes you get it wrong, because it's only through getting it wrong that you get it right, or admitting that there are things you don't know, or dismantling the things that you're certain that you know but which are not very helpful for your learning, because almost we have to start, as everybody knows in the classroom, you start from the things that students are certain that they know, and then you have to sort of take that apart a little bit in order to build it back up, right? So that ability to make mistakes and grow and regulate your own learning, think about what you're doing well, understand what it is you're not doing so well, and regulate that, do better, but also being able to do that in a group, being able as peers to say to each other, maybe that isn't right, or I have a question about what you've said, or maybe somebody in the class has given an answer which isn't quite right, and having the confidence as a group to be able to question that, I think, is really, really important. So what I thought, and I think this comes from your answers as well, what I thought the takeaway from that is that emotions are just incredibly important in our classrooms. And we don't talk very much about emotions. We talk a lot about intellect, we talk a lot about rationality, we talk a lot about the facts and the knowledge and the arguments and the logic, but we talk much less about emotions. And yet emotions are absolutely central to this entire project of learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, Cathy and I, when we've been speaking about this between ourselves, we've been trying to really think about how to bring the sort of concepts of emotions that we work with in our research also into our pedagogy. And I guess, sort of one of the concepts that I think both of us kind of work with and find really useful sort of intellectually, but which we also want to bring into our teaching, is this idea about emotional regimes. So this is an idea that comes from the sort of history of emotions. And it's trying to really get away from the idea that emotions are something that's kind of so inherently kind of personal. It's about who you really are and what you're really feeling inside, that it's like this kind of sort of ahistorical but also very individual, very kind of biological thing, and instead is thinking about emotions as being produced socially. There are structures within which they are sort of developed, and that these are both culturally and historically specific. And I think, if we're thinking about the kind of particular context of higher education today, then there are probably two competing regimes, emotional regimes, that we can think about. One of which positions students as being consumers in a sort of neoliberal emotional regime, which is about individual achievement, but also in the sort of expectations that go along with that, the kind of sense of competition, I guess, and that sort of striving. And then the other positions them much more as partners in a kind of collegial regime, which is much more about sort of curiosity, mutual support, joint engagement with knowledge. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to think about is how we can work with this in the classroom, but also how we can make it visible to students. So how we can sort of show them what sort of kind of emotional pressures, I guess, they're operating within, what kind of expectations they have about how they're feeling and how they should be feeling, and and how they might be pulling in different directions. So by making this explicit, talking about the different kinds of emotional regimes which we might see in our classrooms and those which we would want to encourage, and maybe suggesting that you can't be both a consumer and or a sort of customer and a partner in a kind of collegial learning experience, and sort of asking them how we can go about creating a kind of more mutually supportive emotional regime. That might be one of the things that we want to do. And so, one of the things I guess we want to think about today is, how we can do that. within both the way that we design our modules and also in our kind of day-to-day practice as we are administering them, particularly when we're doing that online.
So we've got another little Menti. We don't have to spend ages on this, but I suppose what we wanted to know was, both online in the little bits of online teaching that we've already done and offline as well, what are you already doing to engage with students' emotions or to produce the kind of emotional regimes that you want to see in your classrooms? You can write a bit more this time, it's not a word cloud. Yeah, encouraging openness. It's really interesting to think about how we encourage openness, isn't it? There's almost saying to people, I encourage you to be open in this classroom. May or may not be the best way of making that happen. Yeah, not a teaching robot, right? But yeah, sometimes we, especially with online learning, perhaps we think so much about the computer and the screen and what it can do, rather than the relationship between human beings that the computer is there to mediate. One-on-one, individual, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's lots here about having individual personal relationships with students, isn't there? I wonder if more stuff is appearing and we can't see it.
Can we scroll down?
Oh, yes, we can. Haha. Yeah, setting ground rules, absolutely. Free writing exercises. Sending words of wisdom. I love that. Yeah, I think this being open is really important as well. I think that's absolutely right. Yes, I love that. Never respond to an emotional comment or complaint with the policy. Yeah, I'm sure we're all guilty of that from time to time, but yeah, it's such a sort of robot, sort of computer says no response, isn't it? But yeah, the policy says we can't give you an extension, sorry. But it's actually what students want us to be listened to. Awesome, thank you for that. Sounds like you're all doing,
I think also on that,
amazing stuff. Emily, go on.
Well, on that one about an emotional complaint, I think something I always have to check about is responding emotionally, on my own emotions too quickly, offensively or whatever as well. But it's not necessarily about what I'm feeling.
Yeah, if somebody comes to you and they're angry, it's hard not to feel angry, isn't it? And so actually just taking a moment to be aware of how you're feeling and then not necessarily acting on that it's really nice. Yeah, and if it's a difficult emotion, then sometimes the natural response is to go straight to the policy or the guideline, because your natural response is to say, I shouldn't say natural, right? Because these things are produced within emotional regimes. But the way that we've been trained to feel is, well, what would a reasonable person do in this situation? Which is often to go back to the syllabus or the guidebook or whatever, rather than to listen to whatever's producing the anger. Yeah, we acknowledge that we learn from each other. I think that's really, really good. That they sometimes know more than us. And it's scary to admit that, but that's okay. Yeah. Show that you're listening. Yeah. Okay, we have nothing to teach you people. You know it all. That's lovely. Okay. So I think the most encouraging thing I've read so far about online teaching is this article by BISA, I think it might be pronounced, and I've put a reference at the end of these slides, which said, don't start from a deficit mentality, don't start from everything we've lost because we've had to go into online teaching and all the things that we won't be able to do and all the ways in which online teaching is a drag and a terrible thing. And instead, let's start from the potential of online teaching. Let's start from what we can do really well. Let's start from what it can give us. And so that doesn't necessarily have to be about the bells and whistles. And I say that as somebody who is as excited as any of you can possibly be about the discovery of iMovie trailers, which are indeed a glorious thing. Keep your eye on Twitter for more. But actually, just because you can do a quiz on Moodle doesn't necessarily mean you should do a quiz. Would you do a quiz in your classroom? If you would do a quiz in your classroom, use Moodle to do a quiz. But if you wouldn't, if you want to build relationships with your students, or you want to have an open conversation, or you want to have group work, then we need to be able to find ways of doing that online. But we can start from the things that computers do allow us to do. And I think also we need to start from those kind of core pedagogical values of what do we care about? What do we really want to be happening in our classrooms? How do we really want people to feel? And then I think we can do that just as easily within these little boxes on the screen that we're all trapped in, as we can within the four walls of the classrooms that we're also trapped in, right? There are different constraints, but there are also different possibilities. So it really cheered me up to read the article. And it's nice because it's got a number of examples within it of other online courses that people have done, often from before we were forced to do online courses, that people have done through choice. I think if we can start positively in that way from the potential of it, then we will find that it's got a lot to offer us in terms of how we feel and the emotions that we're able to promote in our classrooms. And so that reminded me of just how much I enjoyed being an Open University student and how fun that was, and all the things that gave me that being a student in a classroom sitting in rows didn't give me. And so maybe we can start from that positive moment and think to ourselves, what are you going to find it easier to do online? What's better about online? This is another one where you can write more. It's not a word cloud. Yeah, I'm not sure we would have got 50 people to come to a 1-hour seminar with me and Emily if we'd been holding it in central London in a room somewhere. Yeah, attending is so much easier. You can attend so many things now. Yeah. Thinking time, flipped learning. We've all been thinking we should have a flipped classroom for ages, but now we're having to do it. And so we're going to find the time to make those videos and do those embedded learning things on Moodle that we thought about finding the time to do. Yeah, pacing is so much easier to pace things when you're online. Right. This is my thing, right? So if you're less confident with speaking in front of everybody, actually being able to just type your thoughts in the discussion forum and then delete them 3 times and then type them again until you're happy with them. So much easier, so much better. Yeah, can be easier to do breakout rooms. It's easier to mix students up because you don't have to make them get up from their seats and then wander around the room, which they all hate doing. You're just naturally breaking them up into sort of random groups that Moodle or Blackboard Collaborate or whatever makes them do. Yeah, geographical location. It is easier to hide. Yeah, it is easier to hide. So yes, right. It's definitely easier to hide. It's easier to switch your camera off and it's easier not to participate. So that's what we need to think about as teachers. How do we get our students to refrain from hiding in a way that feels all right for them when they were quite happy hiding? Yeah. I think this is, rather than doing things in the way it's always been done, right, we're now having to do things in new ways. And so it breaks us out of just what we were doing because we were lazy or what we were doing because we knew how to do it. We're being forced to do different things. Yeah, hide and unhide. Maybe later when we have a chance to talk properly, we can talk a bit about how we get people to unhide themselves. Yeah. So I'm scrolling down this because it's so nice, such a lot of interesting things. Yeah, more students show up, you can attend more. Yeah, less self-conscious. The chat is so nice if you don't like talking out loud. So did I have anything? So one thing I had, which is I think a really important thing, I get this every year on my student feedback. I have big classes, but I learn everybody's name. and students really appreciate it. So it's a bit of effort on my part, have to admit, especially with the very big classes. But students really appreciate the fact that you know their name. And I think it goes back to this distinction between the neoliberal and the partnership regimes. If you're a customer or a consumer, then somebody doesn't have to know your name because you're just another one in a numberless mass. Whereas if you're working in partnership with somebody, if you've got a relationship with somebody, then knowing their name is the absolute first thing. It's the absolute fundamental thing to having a partnership or having a relationship, is knowing somebody's name. It's dead easy to know everybody's name when you're online because it's written at the bottom of their little box on the screen. So you can't forget it, which doesn't mean that you don't have to make any effort at all, because you have to then remember it later in case you do meet them in person. But knowing people's names is so much easier online. Academics, I guess quite a lot of you probably feel a bit nervous of the hurly-burly of the classroom, of all the opinions flying around, and sometimes quite angry opinions, a lot of emotion in the classroom. That's easier to negotiate online, I think, especially when you can use the chat, you can use the discussion forums. Going at your own pace, I had that too. Having the chance to craft your answer, having chance to understand what everybody's saying, especially if you can use things like captions, or if you're using a discussion forum and you can read over what somebody said more than once, so less opportunity for misunderstanding. It's easier to take time out, so to hide but then to unhide again. Sometimes you need that, right? Sometimes these conversations we're having in class, especially in politics, they're incredibly taxing emotionally, and it's quite nice just to be able to disappear and then reappear a minute later. It's easier to go to the loo if you need to. All these things are easier, right? So this is a great opportunity. Okay. Not having to commute, I know, right? I'm in London, so much happier not having to commute. Okay. So, all right, having done all the positive stuff, what problems might arise? Yeah, so we had this last week. For those of us that were there for Fran's presentation last week, that students who were already disadvantaged are going to be even more disadvantaged and disengaged. I don't think that's inevitable. I think there are things we can do to mitigate that, but that is certainly a worry, particularly when there's these issues around Wi-Fi and time zones and those sorts of things, where it might be very difficult for people to participate, difficult home situations. Yeah, if you've got people arguing in the background, it's very hard to engage in your online class. Yeah, building trust, building relationships with each other. Yeah, such a lot of stuff around connection issues. Yeah. Yes, some of our colleagues that don't want to that don't want to make the shift to online learning. Yeah. Yeah, confidentiality is challenging. Some of these things are problems online or offline, aren't they? So, you know, in a classroom, confidentiality is also challenging.
But people can come to your office hours.
Yeah. Yeah, people can come to your office hours online too, though, right?
Yeah, but if they've got somebody listening at home.
Yeah, if they've got someone listening at home, yeah. Or of course, we've got students whose governments might be spying on them. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think having these difficult conversations, I think we're going to get used to doing that online, and we're going to get better at it. But I agree, at the moment, it's just very hard to have that sort of gentle, supporting structure of conversation, isn't it? Where you're just, that feeling of just being very, very calm and listening very intently is just so much more difficult to recreate when you're on a Skype call. Although I've had some very, very difficult conversations sometimes by the old-fashioned landline, and that can be really nice because you're not staring at somebody's face, and there's an intimacy about the telephone. So, you know, sometimes these things which seem like they might be harder might be easier in a way. We all just need to feel our way and figure out ways of doing it. Yeah. yeah, there's a lot of stuff about disadvantage here, which we did think about, and we're not necessarily talking about that so much because it was addressed last week. But I think that is really the big issue, isn't it? It's students who just can't do the online face-to-face live stuff. And I think I've been thinking a lot more about having discussion boards, and rather than having video recordings of myself doing lectures, having a lot more activities they can engage in online asynchronously, so that you get around some of those problems and you enable everybody to take part.
And I think audio recordings of lectures as well are quite nice. And it feels more intimate in some ways, and getting away from the kind of PowerPoint, and forcing you to rethink it to change from how you've been doing it before.
Yeah, my colleague Alan Rennick has been doing what he calls podcast lectures for a long time, and every year he says to the students, yes, so you can listen to me when you're in the bath, which is a possibility, but perhaps we shouldn't think about it too much. So probably you've thought of a lot of these already yourself, but we had some suggestions which we think you will want to make your own. So you're going to do these things in your own way because you're going to bring your own pedagogical thoughts and values to it. But here are the things that we have started to feel our way towards doing. So I think it's really, really important that students regularly see your face and hear your voice, whether that is in a one-to-one meeting, whether it's in a live classroom, whether it's a recording, just something so that they know who you are, and they know that you care about them. And that is something that I think you are able to put across more when you're actually talking to them in some way or another. Yeah.
I've been thinking about the kind of icebreakers and how that might be quite a different experience online to in person. And I think one of the things, I mean, with all the caveats of what we've just been talking about, you know, people being in difficult home situations possibly, but I think one of the sort of advantages, notwithstanding that, of online teaching is that it is kind of so much more intimate in some ways, rather than bringing everyone into a classroom where they have to kind of establish who they are. You're going into their homes where they already are, or their, you know, bedrooms on campus, or whatever. And I think, you know, maybe something I'd been thinking about anyway was asking students to bring in an object that kind of said something about them or their politics, and asking them to, you know, show them something, show something from their room maybe, might be another way of doing that online.
Yeah, I saw a thing earlier today after I'd made this slide which said, don't use the word icebreaker because ice is cold and hard and awful. And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
But you're breaking it.
Yeah, right. So you're breaking the cold and hard and awful thing. Yeah, but I just think it's going to be so difficult for them to build relationships with each other when they're not there on campus, that just having something to just chit chat about is yeah, really nice. I really like that idea of the object. Some of you may have done an exercise with me and Emily before where we talk about setting the emotional tone of your class in the very first week, where you might get students to bring a controversial opinion with them to class and talk about it. And that sets a fairly challenging emotional tone, where you're asking students to come with a controversial opinion of any sort that they personally hold. And then they go into pairs, and the other student will ask them questions, and all they can do is ask questions. They can't argue back, they can't make their own point, they just have to ask. And that sets an emotional tone of having challenging conversations, of doing so in an open way, of asking questions before you charge in with your own equally contentious view on the other side. And I've been thinking a lot about whether I would do that in an online space. And I don't know what any of you think, but I think I'm not going to, because I think it's such a challenging thing to do, that actually adding that to the challenge of this new experience of being together online, it might just all be too much. So I am thinking myself about what activities will I do right in that first class to set the emotional tone, and talk about how are we going to be together emotionally? How are we going to cope with our emotions in what can be quite an emotional class, quite an emotional journey that these students are going on. And so they could bring with them a slightly less controversial opinion, but still like ask each other questions about it. So just any opinion about politics that you hold, bring to class and be prepared for another student to ask you questions about it. And they won't argue with you, they're just going to ask. And I think that's a really nice tone to set when you get started. And year after year after year, I get feedback from students that say the fact that we did that in the first class meant that I knew there was an expectation on me to talk and to ask questions and to interact with other students. And then I carried on from there because I was already in the habit from that moment. So I think that is something we can do online, either in little breakout groups or even in discussion forums.
The next one, we talked about this a little bit already, but thinking about how you use your body, whether being too still can give the impression of distraction or of loss of internet connection or whatever. But I think I probably have the opposite problem to Cathy. I'm usually pacing around the room and dropping my pens everywhere and that kind of thing, and how to do that without just looking like you're kind of fidgeting online is quite difficult.
Yeah, and I have a colleague who is insistent that you should stand up when you're teaching online. And he says that develops a kind of a respectful relationship between you and your students. I think he teaches a lot of civil servants, so it's a way of sort of asserting your authority and your expertise. That wouldn't be my style because I come to the classroom with a different set of values and a different orientation towards the students. But I think it's just an interesting question to think about. Would I stand up? And if not, why not? And what does that say about how I use my body in the classroom and how I might use my body in this internet space? And somebody had a really good one, a really good suggestion around how to make sure that students know you are listening and not that you've frozen on the screen. And that's to sort of, so if you wear glasses, to gently push your glasses up your nose, or to twiddle with your hair a little bit, or just move a little bit, but in a way that is still maintaining the eye contact with the student with the camera.
Yeah, I think lots of nodding.
Yeah, lots of nodding is really nice, especially when everyone's on mute, right? And you don't get any laughs for your jokes. You want those nods and smiles.
Yeah, and I think also what might be quite hard is that over the summer, I think all of us have probably been participating in a lot of online meetings and have developed kind of conventions for doing that, lots of sort of thumbs up or whatever, which might look really weird to students if they're not used to that.
Yes, yeah, all that waving that you do when it's the end. Yeah, I wonder whether students are going to do that or not. I feel like that's a habit we should get into, but you may disagree. We thought a bit about creating and facilitating social spaces so that students can do that work of, chatting to each other, slagging us off behind our backs if they want to, talking about how inflexible we are about having to talk in class, whatever it might be. And one idea that, I can't remember who suggested this to me, but it wasn't my idea. One idea that came up was to set up a Blackboard Collaborate session or a team session or whatever it is, and just have it running. So the start date is the day your class starts, and the end date is midnight on the last day of term. And they can just go in and out of that call whenever they want and talk to each other, hang out. That's their common room, right? They can just go in there and talk to each other whenever there's somebody else there. They can make arrangements to meet in there. They can go in there for a coffee break. If you wanted, you could be in there once a week so they can come in and chat with you, perhaps with the expectation of what you might want to chat about or what is off limits. So for my class, we all read a novel throughout the term. So I was thinking I might go in there 11 o'clock on a Thursday for my tea break, 20 minutes, and we'll talk about the novel that we're reading. That can be our little book group, for instance. So that might be a nice thing. Obviously, the discussion forums, you can always set up a separate discussion forum just for chatting. You can have a Facebook group just for students to socialize with each other and maybe share links that are of relevance to the class. WhatsApp groups, you can have a class Twitter. You use Padlet, don't you, Emily?
A little bit, not huge amounts, but it's...
Yeah, so just anything like that where you're creating a space where students can just go and chat, and perhaps encouraging them to do it by using it yourself a bit, but not so much that it's their space where they always see you, but enough to maybe lure them in there a bit if they've maybe got a question or something they want to discuss. Yeah,
Padlet's quite good for them creating. I think I'd probably use it more for like dissertation courses or something where they're creating a repository of sources and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This one was something that came from one of Cathy's sort of offline teaching practices, which is to get students early on to reflect on what are the kind of unspoken norms of the class. So, you know, not sitting near the front, answering a little bit so that you don't get picked on, but not too much, you know, not looking too engaged, that kind of thing. And then asking, you know, well, are those the norms we want? What, you know, what other norms could we create? And I think doing that online is going to be interesting as well. You know, what is the norm, or what do we want it to be in terms of, you know, turning on cameras or whatever? You know, are people going to be, you know, sitting at a desk or a table, or are they going to be sort of, you know, slouching on their sofa with a cozy jumper on and a cup of tea? You know, what sort of emotional space, I guess, do we want our classroom to be when it's online, and does it matter if everybody's in the same kind of mode for that?
Yeah, once you get them to understand that there's a difference between what are the rules in this classroom and what are the norms in this classroom, I think that's a really good moment when they make explicit those unspoken norms that they hadn't really reflected on, and realize how unhelpful norms like never put your hand up are in terms of their learning. It can be quite a funny conversation, and then it becomes serious quite quickly, which is nice. So I think it's really important to show your own vulnerability to students. And I think it's one of the hardest things, because we're supposed to be the experts and we're supposed to know everything because we're being paid all this money and they're paying all these tuition fees in order for us to tell them the knowledge. And so actually being a bit vulnerable in front of our students, I think we all find quite difficult. I certainly find it quite difficult. But, you know, we've all asked an unclear question from time to time. And I think it's all right just to talk about that with your students, and to talk about how that makes you feel, but also to talk about how that's all right, and we all have moments where we don't know. So, I mean, just to give you a little example that happened last year in my classroom, I was in my first week of my class on international development. Because I'm very woke, I was talking about the kind of colonial history of international development, and I talked about slaves. I used that word slaves, and a student came very unreflexively, I hadn't thought about it at all. And a student came up to me after the class and said, have you considered talking about enslaved people instead of using a word like slave? And I thought, oh God, yeah, of course, that's exactly right. That's exactly the sort of point that I would normally make to my students. Such a brilliant point. And so the next week I really made a point of saying that I'd learned from this conversation, with her permission, saying that she had made this point to me, and I really encouraged them to consider it, and to consider the difference between using the word slave in comparison with enslaved people, and what that might mean in terms of how they write their essays and think about politics. And I developed such a close relationship with that student going forward, when it would have been the easiest thing in the world to be very defensive about it. And I'm sure there are lots of times when I am defensive when a student picks me up on something. And I think if you can just grasp those moments to be vulnerable, I think that's always a really nice opportunity, which you shouldn't turn down if you have the chance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Saying sorry to students as well is really, really powerful if you get something wrong. Yeah.
And I think, yeah, it makes such a difference to them as well, I think. I mean, this next one is something that I've been finding easier actually since the pandemic. You know, creating opportunities for students to reflect on how they're feeling. Suddenly asking them, you know, regularly, you know, how is everybody? How are you feeling? Didn't feel kind of as weird and sort of intrusive as maybe it had done previously. And people were more willing to talk about it, and kind of seemed to think it was a more normal question to be asking, a bit less awkward than sometimes when I've asked that to, you know, 30 first years who don't really want to talk about how they're feeling at all. But I also think it can be a good thing to build into, whether it's formally, I know Cathy does this as a sort of mode of assessment, sort of asking students to write a reflexive sort of piece about their emotional response to the module, that kind of thing, or whether it's something that you do less formally and perhaps even more privately, you know, maybe creating breakout rooms that you don't participate in on Zoom, where they reflect on how they're feeling about the course and you don't get to hear that, might be quite valuable as well, I think.
Yeah, we've talked already quite a lot about creating opportunities for students to work together, but if they are obliged in some way to work together, even if that's some kind of formative thing, it doesn't have to be, you know, the big summative assessment group work, the perils of assessing group work and so on, but just creating some kind of moral pressure on them to work together is really good when they don't necessarily have those opportunities to build relationships with each other, or perhaps those opportunities are unevenly distributed across the class. So I have been thinking about, for example, I normally do a big simulation about halfway through the term. And if anyone's interested in how that goes in a sort of classroom, sort of 60 people in a room way, then I've written about that on the ALPS, the Active Learning in Political Science blog. And if anyone has any good ideas about how I can make that an online activity, I am all ears. But once I've done it, I'll probably write it up and you can share it. But I was thinking, like, having across the term rather than in one 3-hour session, having students all have a role within some kind of simulation activity where they have to meet in this hypothetical online common room that we're going to have and figure out what their presentation is going to be and be ready to present their work sort of halfway through the term as part of a simulation in their role as midwives or the WHO, or so this, in my case, is a health, global health simulation, which might be quite appropriate in the context of a pandemic, but just something that forces them to work together and forces them to do something to the rest of the, do some kind of activity with the rest of the class, I think is really nice. Just and ideally to mix up the groups a little bit so that they're meeting people they wouldn't necessarily otherwise have met in that process would be quite nice. And you can also do whether it's discussion forums, breakout rooms, book groups. There's all sorts of things you could do, but that was one suggestion.
Yeah, I like that idea. And then the final one, the kind of perennial question or perennial problem of how to get students to recognise the value of office hours and attend them. And I think people's approaches to doing this online have been really different. I know I'm in a very small department, and even talking to colleagues there are loads of different approaches. So some people are opening a Skype call or a Zoom call and just kind of letting it run for the hour or the 2 hours, and students can pop in if they want and just wait in the waiting room until the person before them has gone. Some people are doing away with particular hours altogether and just having a open booking system where students can book any time they want through the week and come at a time that's convenient to them. People are doing all sorts of different things. I don't know whether it matters having a consistent approach across departments, but I do think that explaining the value of it seems even more difficult in some ways when it's online. That students, I feel, are probably more likely to only come if they've actually got a problem. They're less likely to just sort of rock up for a chat, and trying to nudge them into doing that. Perhaps when we were talking about this before the session, Cathy suggested something like saying, the vast majority of you have been to see me in my office hours, might encourage the vast majority of them to do that. But I think, it's something that we need to be thinking about as academic advisors or, pastoral tutors or whatever it's called in your department.
Yeah, I think normalising that, because when I was a student, I would have considered it the greatest of failures to go to office hours and ask for help. And now I realise that the students who do well tend to be the ones that come to office hours and extensively discuss their work. Yeah, so I think just making sure everybody knows that, and that it's just the totally absolute normal thing that you come is really good, online and offline, but especially now.
But it might also feel more awkward, and maybe thinking of ways that, different forms, I guess, than just sort of asking them to sit in a single Skype call with you.
Yeah, I mean, the drop-in the virtual common room might be a way to think about it. Yeah. Okay, so I really just wanted to do this quite quickly, but I've lost a student to suicide in the past, and what I wouldn't give to be able to go back and do something about that. And he didn't give us a lot of clues, but you never know when the chance might come where you're going to be the person that can make a difference in somebody's life, and when your care and involvement could be the thing that changes the outcome. So this is just a really quick run through. If something does seem really wrong, if you see a student who is quiet and withdrawn beyond what you would normally expect of them, if they come and see you and they talk at all about feeling worthless, or it sounds like they feel as if they're a burden on somebody else, right, that could be a student who is feeling suicidal. And there is lots of training online to help you develop your skills in dealing with that situation if it should come up, and I'm going to give you some links at the end. But basically the message is, from all these different courses, and I've done a lot of them now, is just don't be afraid to talk about it, right? If somebody's feeling suicidal, you asking them if they feel suicidal is not going to make them feel worse. They already feel terrible. And if you say the word suicide, it's less likely that that student or that person is going to take their life. It's going to make it less likely, not more likely, if you talk about it with them. And it's really good to have that conversation in a specific way. So you want to be asking, if they say, yes, I'm having suicidal thoughts, you want to ask them, have you made a plan? Have you thought about how you might do it? Right, that's the conversation that is going to help. And we're obviously not counsellors, but what we can do is, if somebody is obviously in the middle of a suicide attempt or they're in imminent danger, you just need to ring 999. I know it seems like we've all been taught that ringing 999 is a massive thing to do, but sometimes that is what you need to do, or take them to A&E. If they're just having thoughts, but they say that they're safe for now and they know that it's only thoughts, then I'm sure you have student wellbeing services in your university. You also can refer to GPs, of course, the Samaritans, and there's this great website called Hub of Hope, which will refer to local resources in your area. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm happy to talk more about that if you want. Okay, and I'm conscious we've taken up quite a lot of time, but we've got 5 minutes if there were any questions or anything anyone wanted to discuss.
Thanks. So there's been a couple of questions coming through. I'll fire some, if we sort of do some quick ones, maybe we'll get through a couple. First of all, with the online calendar app for setting appointments, is there any particular one you found particularly useful?
I just use Moodle.
Moodle.
So if you have Moodle, you can set up a scheduler in Moodle. Do you have a different one, Emily?
I haven't even started looking into this yet, but I saw there was a recommendation in the chat for Calendly, which I have heard before.
Yeah.
So people have mentioned Bookings and Bookable. I don't know if you have to pay for those.
Yeah, I've heard of Calendly before. Yeah, but if you have Moodle, then that works fine.
Wonderful. A question was asked by Lee Jones a little while ago. When you were saying, I think, about how you were not going to run this kind of thing where somebody put a controversial opinion. And I think he was sort of asking something along the lines of, in a culture where people perhaps are used to sort of abusive behaviour online, and it's people say things online they'd never say face to face. Is this potentially a problem, and what can you do with your students to try and sort of support them and avoid that becoming the cultural thing?
That's such an interesting question. Have you ever had that, Emily? I haven't.
It seems to me that that's more likely when it's at least partly anonymous and people are just writing, and, you know, that might come up in discussion boards, but it seems unlikely to come up in a sort of Zoom seminar or that kind of thing.
I have the opposite problem, to be honest. I find that people aren't willing enough to sort of have a view and stand by it. They're very polite and very deferent with each other. And so sometimes when we have our conversation about controversial opinions at the start of term, they want to know, they really want to know, is there anything we can't say? And I sort of say to them, I don't want hate speech in my classroom, but I really don't feel that that is very likely, and they all laugh. So I don't know if that's the sort of university we are, I don't know if that's a problem elsewhere, but ultimately, nothing that we do in Moodle is anonymous. So ultimately, there is always the student code of conduct if we can't have those conversations first about the sorts of things we can and can't say. But yeah, talking about it openly, I think, is almost always the answer.
Excellent. In terms of the emotional regimes work, I think that was fascinating what you were saying, and I think just looking at the chat, it's got quite a bit of interest. If one wants to know something about emotional regimes, what's the best thing to pick up to sort of try and get an understanding of emotional regimes, the way of thinking about things?
The sort of classic text was by William Reddy. I can't actually remember what it was called. Well, since we are online, let me just have a minute.
And while you're doing that, so I came across a reading by Eloise Simons, which was in the most recent edition of Critical Education Studies. And that's where this idea of neoliberal versus partnership regimes came from?
The Navigation of Feeling, a Framework for the History of Emotions by William Reddy, 2001, is sort of where that kind of framework comes from in a history context.
And you should also read Emily Robinson's recent co-authored paper about emotional regimes in the context of Brexit, because that's very, very good, and I have my students read it too.
Excellent. I think that'll be extremely. Yeah, I could see immediately, sort of as soon as you started talking about that people were interested in sort of this a new lens on some of these issues that I think will be really helpful and really help us. We're just reaching the end of time now, so in terms of not running over, we need to call it a day. But thank you very much indeed to our two speakers. That's been a real tour de force in terms of their experience and a great way of capturing all of our experiences through the use of the online chat. And I can't remember what the app was called, but it was
Menti.
Menti, thank you.
Yeah.
Use of Menti. And just to flag up for people, on this Thursday at 3 p.m. we've got Will Brown from the Open University, who's doing the next of the PSA BISA teaching and learning webinars, and he will be speaking about modular design. So hope to see you all then. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.